Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Claim property for accounts payable can be a tedious manual process, from identifying what is unclaimed property to sending letters to vendors to avoid the complicated process of transferring that property to the applicable states. Now, in between those two steps, there are 4 vendor setup and maintenance tasks that might make the process easier. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 291. 4 vendor setup and maintenance tasks that can make the unclaimed property process easier. Now, you might think, well, how the heck is unclaimed property related to the vendor team? So let's start by just explaining what unclaimed property is. And so, unclaimed property is property that is held, issued, or owed by your organization that has not been resolved or settled. By your vendor over a specified period of time. So in accounts payable, this would be ACH payments, right, that are returned and not reissued. Or it could also be checks that have not been cashed, right? So maybe you didn't have the right address. And then for both the ACH return payments and the checks that are not cashed, right? You've reached out to the vendor, you can't locate them. You've sent, multiple communications, and they have not responded to your request. And by the way, that is the piece that my vendor team used to do as part of the unclaimed property process. I believe Treasury had it, but we were always the ones that still had to send out those last minute letters to see if we could, make one last ditch effort to contact the vendor so that we could get the right banking information, get the right address so that we could then send that payment, and then it wouldn't have to be sent off to the state. So that kind of made it the vendor process, at least part of it. I hated it too because it was always really a manual process of getting those letters out, and we didn't outsource it. So again, we had to do it within the vendor team, and so that kind of made it ours, which kind of brought up why I wanted to have like as less as possible that needed to be considered unclaimed property. And that's where, these 4 tips came from. But that's how the vendor team got involved. One is that we were the ones that would collect the addresses, and we were also the ones that would collect the banking information. So we were kind of involved already. But in any event, you've got these payments that came back, either ACH or checks, that were not paid to your vendor and is just sitting at your company, right? That property does not belong to your company. at some point, if the you don't get it to the vendor and the vendor cashes the checks or has the ACH deposits or payments deposited, that money or those payments have to be turned over to the state as unclaimed property. And really, the state is now or will then be the custodian of the property. Now, the state that the payments need to be turned over to is the state of the last known address of the vendor. Now, speaking of states, they have their own rules that are different from each other. It couldn't be easy, right? It's just like 1099s. If you're reporting to states, all the states have different rules, like the dormancy period can be different. And that's how long before your company has to turn it over to the state. Also, exemptions can be different, reporting requirements can be different. But I will tell you that is the subject of an overview training session that I have coming up on June 6th. It's called From an Accounts Payable Perspective, a step-by-step approach to the unclaimed property process. And this is really if your team, your vendor team, has the responsibility of unclaimed property. And I believe that prior to me inheriting my vendor team, where we did ended up just doing the letters to the vendors, so communication to the vendors. That team or the vendor team used to handle it, but then it moved to Treasury. But no matter whether your team has to follow that process or has to process the unclaimed property, right? And send that off to the state, or whether you're just doing the communication letters or whether you're doing something in between. This is a good overview, a step-by-step approach to the unclaimed property process. Again, from an accounts payable perspective, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And you can enroll to attend live and be able to ask questions, or you can enroll and then watch on demand anytime after June 6th. I usually have the updated recording up within 24 hours. So make sure you check out that link in the show notes if you're interested. But on today's episode, I do want to talk about 4 vendor setup and maintenance tasks that can be done to make the unclaimed property process easier. And why? Because these tasks, when done, should reduce the number of payments that are not processed or settled by the vendor, and thus then do not have to be turned over to the applicable state as unclaimed property. So you have less volume of unclaimed property that you have to deal with. And even though we were just dealing with the communication piece of it, sending out the last ditch effort letters, less volume would have been less letters that we would have had to send out. And so these 4 things are things that you really should be doing on an ongoing basis. It's not something that you should be doing just once or twice. I do recommend at least the first 2 that you do them on a monthly basis. And so the first one is to check for and remove duplicate vendors, because duplicate vendors means that the other check or the other ACH may not be cashed. It may be returned back, resulting in the need for transferring the unclaimed property to the state. And so if you've made a duplicate payment, your vendor may not process that payment. And maybe they let you know, maybe they don't. But now that check is not cashed or that ACH is returned. And if that's not processed, then again, that will increase the volume of unclaimed property that has to be sent to the state. The second one is really just to clean your vendor master data. So stale vendor remittance addresses, for example, for check payments or stale bank account details for electronic payments really result again in the need for unclaimed property, because if you haven't paid your vendor or done business with them in right 15, 18, 24 months, whatever threshold for your vendors that you consider is appropriate for that information to now be considered stale, that means that there is a high probability that when you do pay that vendor, uh, that the payments are going to come back because that information has now changed. And if it comes back, again, that means that it's going to increase the number of unclaimed property payments you're going to have to send to the state. Now, this is one reason why I really advocate cleaning the vendor master file on a consistent basis. Now, I do recommend that you do clean your vendor master file on a monthly basis. If you can't do that monthly, then you can do it on a quarterly basis. Or maybe on a semi-annual basis, but at the very least on an annual basis. Because if you do it annually, that's really going to mean that you may have a lot of cleanup that you may have to do, and it may be overwhelming to do it all at once. And so if you do it on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annual basis, you won't have as many to do because in the later months, a lot of the cleanup will already have been done. And so you do want to make sure you are verifying that the addresses are still valid. Now, there you may have some resources where you can verify that the address belongs to the vendor. And then you can also use like bulk upload for address validations. And it's not just to verify that the addresses are mailable, which is good, because that's good anyway, though, because it does catch those checks that you send out that's going to come back because the addresses are not valid. But it also tells you if the addresses are what the status of the addresses are. So you want to make sure that they are mailable. That's the first thing. But you also want to make sure that they're not inactive, that they are not vacant. And there is a bulk upload solution that will tell you that, or a platform that will tell you that. It's called Smarty, and it's smarty.com. Now, if you download my vendor validation reference list with resource links, you will find some options for validating your vendor's address that is mailable. But with Smarty, you can also validate that it is that the address, like the address status, that it's not vacant, and also that it's not inactive. And it also does offer that bulk upload. So you can take all of your vendor's address, your active vendor's addresses, and upload them. And it takes like 2 seconds to get the results back. Now, it is a paid service, but you do get a free tier for US addresses. And so you'll want to see if you are within the number of addresses you have are within that free tier. Probably not, because the last I checked, I think it was 250, but it is a free tier, and it does offer a bulk upload versus the one-by-one lookup. And you may have other solutions, right, that you can use. The key is that you do need to check the addresses to make sure that they're mailable, and to make sure that the status does not mean that they are not, whatever you mail them is not going to get there like those checks. And it's not this, just the checks that you can validate during that cleaning up your vendor master data process or task. You can also verify that the bank account or the bank branch information is still valid. So the routing numbers, now banks merge and get acquired all the time, and the routing numbers can change. And at some point, right, if that happens to your vendor may not let you know, especially in those situations. Most times the bank account number for your vendor will not change, only the routing number. And so they don't always tell you that. And when you send that payment off to your bank, that ACH payment that has the vendor's bank account number and let's say that old routing number, some banks will continue to change that for you so the payment can be successful, but they won't do that forever. Eventually, you'll get reported or may get reported for a NACHA violation, and then they will start rejecting those payments. They won't be successful. And so now, if you don't process that, eventually, not only will you have a mad vendor, but if the vendor doesn't catch it, then you may fall into this unclaimed property process. And so you do want to make sure you're cleaning your vendor master file data and you're checking the address and that you are also checking your routing numbers. Now, again, if you need resources to check the routing numbers, you can download for free the vendor validation reference list with resource links. The link is in the show notes, and you'll find a resource for validating U.S. bank routing numbers, either for wire or for ACH. All right, number three is to implement a process for return checks. So, just like I said, you need to validate your vendor addresses by cleaning it as part of your cleaning up your vendor master file. Uh, when you do have checks that are returned because the addresses were not good or they don't belong to your vendor, then you need to make sure that you find the address and send out the check again so the vendor will receive it and will cash it. So you need to have a process for the returned checks. Now, usually what we did is we noted that the check was returned. We put a comment in the vendor file, and that was after the payment room received the return check, at which time they had already voided the check. And so it was up to us now to contact the vendor and find the correct address and update it in our system. So then the payments team could then reissue that check. Now, as part of finding the updated address, right? If the address wasn't correct, maybe something was wrong with it. Maybe we didn't format it correctly, right? So that it was mailable. If that was the case, we fixed it and then the team reissued the check. But if it was just the wrong address, we would have a process where we would reach out to the vendor to update their address, and we would do that in a secure way. So make sure that, whatever as part of your vendor setup and maintenance process, if you have a secure way for vendors that when they reach out, they want to update their address. And so you may have some internal controls surrounding that. Use that same process to update your vendor's address. So, a great example that I've probably said on the podcast before, but if you are updating your vendor's address, you should have that as part of your vendor setup form. And you should also require the old address in addition to their new address. And any other steps as part of that process of updating their vendor address that you do, make sure you also do it when the address needs to be updated when checks are returned as well. All right, now the fourth one is to implement a process for changed, rejected, returned electronic payments. And so this is just like the return checks, right? So the address is not correct, so it's going to come back. And with the electronic payments, then the address or the banking details, something is not correct. And so it's either going to be changed by the bank so that the payment can be successful. And again, I talked about this before. This is where, right, the routing number may have changed due to a merger or acquisition. And so they will go ahead and change it and so that the payment can be successful, but they're not going to do that forever. But in any event, when they make that change, they're going to send you a notice of change. And it used to come back in the day by fax. Nowadays, it probably comes to you by email, or maybe you log on to your bank's portal and get them. But you do need to make sure that you make that change because, again, they're not going to do it for forever. And eventually, they're going to start rejecting or returning those payments with the wrong banking information on it. And not only are you then susceptible to a NACHA violation, but you also have a vendor that hasn't been paid, and they can make a call to you, right? Getting like even higher volume of phone calls, or they cannot notice it, and eventually that payment that hasn't been made to your vendor is going to age and may become unclaimed property. And so you need to make sure that any notifications you get from your bank about changed or returned payments, you have to do the same thing that you do with your checks. Reach out to the vendor, find or use the same process that you use for changing banking, all the internal controls, all the best practices, all the validations that you use in a normal process of changing vendor banking. You need to do the same thing in this case as well. So if you're doing a confirmation call, do that. If you require a banking form, make sure they fill that out. If you require existing banking in order to change to new banking, make sure you put that in place too. So everything that you do to avoid fraud when you're making or when the vendor requests a change of banking, do the same thing again to avoid fraud when you initiate a request to the vendor to give them or to give you updated banking. All right, now there could be other tasks that could help to avoid unclaimed property with your vendors, but these are four big ones, and I'll repeat them again. The first one is to check for and remove duplicate vendors. The second one is to clean your vendor master data, and that is checking remittance addresses are correct and that the bank account details for electronic payments are correct, that the routing number being used hasn't been updated based on an acquisition or a merger, that you're also efficiently processing return checks so that you can identify a valid, corrected address to send those checks to. And then the last one, that you are processing those changed or rejected, returned electronic payments so that you always have updated banking information for the vendor. All right, now each of these four should help to reduce the volume of unclaimed property that has to be sent to the applicable state, which is great not only for your organization, but also for whichever team has to process unclaimed property. And I bet no matter which team it is, somehow the vendor team is going to get involved because those letters need to be sent out. Maybe additional work needs to be done before or in preparation for unclaimed property. And if you want an overview of the unclaimed property process from an accounts payable perspective, make sure that you check the link in the show notes for the link to enroll in the session. And then also don't forget to check the show notes for the vendor validation reference list with resource links for resources to validate the vendor addresses as well as the vendor bank details. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 291st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.